The world thinks the church is homophobic, thinks the church doesn't understand homosexuality. The church isn't homophobic. The church does understand homosexuality.
Living Out is happening now because of the unprecedented challenge and change in our culture and in the church.
Living Out is for you if you are somebody that experiences same-sex attraction. We want you to hear different stories from the ones you're perhaps hearing. We want you to hear that it's possible to stay loyal to what the Bible says and flourish in life.
Those who first experience some kind of same-sex attraction can feel completely isolated. No one else feels like this. You are not alone.
We particularly want it to be an encouragement and a help to those Christians who, like us, experience same-sex attraction, a place where they can hear stories of other Christians who are dealing with some of these issues.
It's for you if you are a church leader. We want to equip you to pastor the people in your church family who experience same-sex attraction.
It's for the church as a whole to help Christians think through this issue biblically, to provide stories, testimonies. I guess it's for everyone.
So I'm going to introduce my friend Luke. He's going to join me on stage now. He's going to be answering some questions about himself. So chance to get to know a few of us a little bit better, chance to hear from some same-sex attracted Christians about sort of our experience of that journey. So Luke, we've planned a few questions. We'll see if those are the questions that I actually ask you now.
Who knows?
Yeah. So maybe we could start off. Love you to tell us a bit about yourself.
So, in a real nutshell, my name's Luke. I work in creative direction for Christian events, which is a very fancy way of saying I swan into places and ask for more purple light and things like that. And I do some writing, I do filmmaking, all sorts of things like that. So I'm a very sort of creative sort of person. But I'm just about to put aside lots of my career stuff and go and train for ordination for ministry. So that's the next big step on my journey.
Very exciting. So for you, this stuff about sexuality, identity is an important and personal issue. Could you tell us a bit about how you became aware of your sexuality and what did you do about that?
Yeah, so around about the age of 12 or so, 11 or 12, I started to realize that unlike many of my friends who were starting to be attracted to girls and talking about girls, that just wasn't me. I didn't get that. And I started to realize that actually I was attracted to guys. And so sort of through those early teenage years, I was coming to terms with that. But particularly as I got into my older teens, that started to become quite a core sort of part of my identity, that I'm gay, that's part of my identity, this is who I am, this is what defines me apart from everyone else around me. What was interesting was then that when I was about 15, I got invited to church and started to engage in Christianity, started to journey through and understand who is this God that some of my friends are talking about. I had absolutely no idea there might be any sort of tension between my sexuality and the thought of having faith. So I came to faith, and shortly after I was doing what Christians do, which is sort of, reading the Bible, but I didn't know how to do that. So I used to flick through and then randomly stop on a page and be, today I'm reading from the contents. And one day I did that and landed on the passage in Leviticus and saw the heading had sexual in it, which I thought was quite funny to see sexual in the Bible. But then felt like a brick wall hit me when I encountered some of the text in the Bible, and I started to then dig in and try and understand how does my faith and my sexuality interact. And that was a really tough sort of journey for me. And I've traveled theologically across the spectrum, but also sort of personally, there was a lot of sort of personal journey on that, as I felt initially that there were sort of two halves to me, the gay Luke and the Christian Luke, pulling in opposite directions. And so there's a bit of a journey of reconciling that.
Great, thank you. That's great to hear. And so that you've spoken a little bit about identity there and sexuality. This session, our first session together this morning, is on culture and identity. How do you think for you as a Christian with sort of experience in this area, how do you think we're affected by our culture?
Yeah, I think it's really clear how culturally there's a real difference, but just between generations, in terms we can see the cultures sort of ever more pushing in a particular direction, but also sort of more broadly we see cultural differences between the church and the world around us. The most obvious way is in the sexual ethics that are being promoted and encouraged, but those are sort of a root cause of something much further back. And I think for me, part of the interesting of my journey of coming to terms with identity has been the pressure and the lie that our culture teaches us is that you are what you consume. Everything is about that. So whether it's the clothes you wear or the phone you have, or whether it's the sexual experiences you have, the people you tick off your list, it's all about consuming. It's about what I get out of these things and how I can do that. And for me as a Christian, I think the huge challenge and surprise to me was that everything in the gospel talks about what are you going to pour out, what are you going to lay down, what are you going to sacrifice to God, which is so completely against the consumeristic, materialistic culture which we have and which is carried over into how we deal with other people. And I actually think that's one of the issues why we see a big generational difference, even as we talk about these issues in the church, is that for my generation and for millennials and people who are younger than millennials, whatever they're called, we are so used to consuming and to being able to have and to take, and we're quite a greedy generation because we have so much at our fingertips. And we've carried that over to relationships. And as a church, I think parts of the church have woken up to say, we need to challenge this, we need to speak into this. But there's still a hypocrisy with the church. Are we also challenging the wider consumeristic sort of culture and mindset, which is actually our views on sexuality are a symptom of these? And so I think maybe part of the tension I see is that under 30s can see some hypocrisy in the way that the church deals with the sacrifice that is demanded in our sexuality and our relationships, and actually the sacrifice that's demanded more generally for all Christians. And I think as a church, we should be pursuing a culture of radical, sacrificial discipleship. And when we do that, I think the message of radical sacrificial relationships and radically sacrificial sexuality will make more sense, because that's where we find our identity. We find it through the sacrifice that Christ has done. We find it in our relationship with God. We find it in pouring ourselves out for the sake of others rather than for consuming everything we can. So
Amazing.
That's probably my thoughts.
Great. What a great way to start our time together. Thank you so much, Luke. Great thoughts.
I'm glad to be here with you. Luke actually set this up pretty well, because what we're really going to be spending most of our time talking about today is the culture's understanding of identity, which is what makes the culture's approach to sex and gender plausible. And if Christians just try to attack the modern view of sex and gender and say, no, that's not biblical, that's true, but it's also not going to sound very plausible to people unless you're able to, as it were, pull back and actually not so much attack, but undermine the very understanding of identity that is the basis for everything the culture says about gender and sexuality. So this first lecture, well, let me say it this way, start this way. Every culture essentially imposes on its members a particular way of doing identity formation, and it doesn't ask your permission, and it doesn't tell you what it's doing. I mean, even today we have terms like finding yourself and identity, and 500 years ago they didn't. But the fact was, every culture then, now, every culture today has a way of giving its members an identity. That is, it says, here's how you get a sense of self and a sense of worth. I'll get to that in a minute. Every culture says, here's how you get a sense of self, and here's how you get a sense of worth. And they don't ask you. It doesn't ask you. It just imposes it on you. It doesn't tell you what it's doing. It just calls you into it. So that if you actually ask almost any member of any culture, how does identity formation happen? They go, what? Even though they're doing it. Identity formation is, we relate to identity formation the way fish relate to water. If you ask a fish to tell you something about water, the fish will say, what's water? It's so obvious, it so surrounds them so much they don't even know it's there. And if you actually ask the member of any society, unless maybe they're a sociologist or an anthropologist, if you ask any member of society, how does identity formation happen here, they'd say, what are you talking about? But Christians are always outliers In every single culture, the way Christians get an identity, the way Christian identity is formed, is always radically different. If the Christians, in a sense, fit in too much, if they become too much like the culture, they just adopt the culture's approach to identity, which, by the way, is happening. I'm going to try to show you. So let's talk about this. And I'm afraid this first talk is going to be, it's going to seem a little bit like an academic lecture, a little bit. It's going to have a bit of that. Because what I want to do is I want to make the modern culture's a process of identity formation visible to you. It actually isn't visible to us because we're here. We're like fish in the water. But I want to try to make it visible to you so it becomes less inevitable, actually, to you. So when I say identity, I do mean a sense of self and a sense of worth. An identity, a sense of self means that you've got a lot of roles. You're in the family, you're at work, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a child. You've got all these roles, but what is the core you that is true in all the roles that gives you a sense of self? It's always true. And what I think philosophers, psychologists would say, your sense of self comes from what you think is the most important thing. What are you really living for? What is your bottom line? What is the highest moral good? What is the greatest good for your life? That's what gives you a sense of self, because no matter what else you're doing, whatever role you're having, you're serving that. That gives you a sense of self. Sense of worth comes from who is your ultimate validator? Who gets to tell you whether or not you're living up to your ideals, whether you're serving your highest good properly? So an identity is a sense of self and a sense of worth. It's what's the most important thing in your life that you serve, and who you give the authority to tell you whether or not you are living up, whether you're good or bad. The ultimate validator evaluates you. Now, this talk versus next talk, we're going to take a look strictly at the modern identity, how it's formed, and what's wrong with it. And then the second talk will be the Christian identity, how it's formed, and what's great about it. Okay, so first, forgive me for the academic sort of tone to this. There is a book that I'm not saying everybody in this room ought to read, but if you're a Christian leader, you need to know what's in it. And it's a book by Charles Taylor, Catholic Canadian philosopher. And he wrote this book some years ago called Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. An extraordinarily important book. And if you don't read it, it's very academic, not at all an easy read. It's also an enormously long read. And yet, what's in that book is absolutely crucial to make the modern identity formation process visible. So what he does here is he actually, as you can tell, when it says the making of modern identity, he actually gives you a history in Western culture of how identity's been formed. And here's how it starts. In the beginning, the greatest good is honor. At the ancient Greek and Romans, go back even further than them, identity was formed by, first of all, telling everybody the greatest thing to live for is honor. The honor of your people, your own honor, the honor of your family. And honor meant usually to die in battle. For women, it meant to have a lot of children, because it was a way of sacrificing yourself. It was very dangerous to have children at that time. It was a heroic thing for the woman to have children, because that's the only way the tribe was going to survive. And it was a heroic thing to go into battle to defend your tribe, because other people would just enslave you if you didn't go into battle. And if you're a man going into battle, so in some ways it was very, very basic, but basically your identity was this. If you're a person of honor and you put your people before your own selfish interests, then the community validated you and called you a person of honor, and you had a sense of self and you had a sense of worth. Now, as the centuries went by, Taylor says when you get to the philosophers, so Aristotle, Plato, some of that became modified a bit. And the Greek and Roman philosophers said, well, the moral good out there, they called it a kind of sacred order, a kind of cosmic order. Some of you may know if you've ever heard anybody do a good Bible exposition of John chapter 1, where it says in the beginning was the Word, and of course the Greek word there is logos, and very often the expositor will tell you that the ancient Greeks and Romans believed that there was a kind of transcendent moral order behind the universe. They called it the logos. It was the way you ought to be. It was, we would today call it a set of moral absolutes. And the philosophers believed there was a set of moral absolutes, there was a sacred order, a way that human beings ought to live. And what it meant to have a good self-image, be a good person, was that you didn't live a selfish life, but you aligned yourself with these moral absolutes. Now, there was differences of opinion about what those moral absolutes were. But basically, everybody agreed there's moral absolutes out there, and your job, it was to sublimate your selfish interests to honor those moral absolutes. And again, if you did that, the community would be your ultimate validator. The community would say you're a person of virtue, or you're a person of honor, or you're a person of moral integrity. So in all ancient times, the moral good that you were serving was outside of you. And the validators, the people who could tell you whether you're a good person or not, was your family, your parents, your community, but again, people outside you. And then the modern era came. Now, one of the things that Taylor would say is, well, let's call that the traditional identity. And in the non-Western world today, especially amongst older people, people over 40, in the non-Western world today, if you go to Africa and Asia, if you go to Latin America, that's still the way identity is formed. Basically, you know you're a good person if you sacrifice for your family and you sacrifice for your people, and you don't just live a selfish life. And then your people and your family says you're a good son or you're a good daughter. That's how you get an identity. That's how you get a sense of self and a sense of worth. And that's still true in the non-Western world, especially if you're over the age of 40. But in the Western world, and actually even in the non-Western world, amongst younger people who are plugged into the global media world, in the Western world, that's changed. And what Charles Taylor does is he goes through and shows that the modern world came in what he would say, the modern identity came in 3 stages. He calls it early modernity, romanticism, and now today, late modernity or post-modernity. The first, early modernity, which is the 16th and 17th century, what we'd call the Enlightenment. Notice this very interesting thing. He said, this very interesting shift. He says, early modern people still believe there was a sacred order, there were moral absolutes outside me. And to be a good person, I had to align with those. But it was for the first time in history that people like Locke and Descartes and the people of the Enlightenment said, however, you don't find those moral absolutes through tradition, you don't find it through the Bible, you don't find it through anybody telling you what they are. You have to determine them in your own reason, your own rationality, your own reason, your own intuitions. That is the highest authority. And you don't let anybody tell you. You determine what those moral absolutes are. So you see, there's been a shift. Because even though you don't determine the good, now you discern the good. Nobody else discerns it for you. Nobody tells you what it is. By the time you get to Romanticism, and you get to Rousseau and to Schiller and to Goethe and those folks, Romanticism still said there was a sacred order outside, and to be a good person, you had to serve that sacred order outside. But Romanticism said the way you find what that sacred order is you go deep into yourself. Not just through reasoning, but you go into your heart, you go into your feelings, you go into your emotions. Through art, through self-exploration, through self-expression, you get in touch with that cosmic order because you are connected to it. But when you get finally down to late modern, when you finally get down to post-World War II, late 20th century, early 21st century, what's called late modern or sometimes postmodern, Charles Taylor says finally the process that had been going on and on and on, which you can see, finally gets complete. Because not only do late modern people, are they told, you go into your own heart to discern what is right or wrong for you, but they actually say there is no moral good outside of the self, right? Late modern culture says all moral value is relative. All moral value is socially constructed by your culture. Or maybe it's the leftover of your evolutionary biology, and there are certain feelings you had that helped your ancestors survive, and so you still have them. But in the end, there are no moral absolutes out there. So you don't just discern the good for which you will live, you determine the good for which you will live. You don't just discern it, you determine it. And now you have, finally, as Charles Taylor says, a completely internal self, a completely interior identity. You are the ultimate validator. Nobody tells you what is right or wrong for you. You are the determiner of what's good. You decide, you define it. And this has never happened before. And so let me give you the contrast here. Charles Taylor says there's 4 massive contrasts between traditional identity formation, which is still happening in big parts of the world, and which used to happen in the past. Huge differences between the traditional identity formation and modern identity formation. First of all, we've moved, the ultimate good of the self has moved from outward to inward. Traditional, ancient times, the good was out here, and to be a good person, you sacrificed your inner impulses and desires to serve this outward good. But in modernity, it's completely the opposite. You determine what is good, and you don't sacrifice yourself for what is good. Rather, you find the good in your desires, which leads to the second big difference. So you move from a completely externally oriented identity to an internally oriented identity. Number 2, the very stuff of the self moves from duties to desires. Duties to desires. Let me read it to you the way Charles Taylor would say it. In traditional cultures, you are basically your duties. That's who you really are. That's the stuff of the self. You are your duties, and your self-worth depends on the honor your community bestows on you as you sacrifice your desires to fulfill those duties. But in modernity, you are your desires. It's exactly the opposite. You are your deepest desires, your dreams, your aspirations, and your self-worth now depends on the dignity you bestow on yourself as you realize and assert those desires against any claims from outside groups like family or community or nation or God. See, it's completely the opposite. Which thirdly means the big argument happens in a very different place. In traditional identity formation, you go outside to figure out what is the highest good. And out there, you're taught what the highest good is. Then you come inside and you argue with your heart and you say, heart, you got to live according to this. You can't live any old way you want, see? So you go outside to find the good. Then you come inside and you argue with yourself to align with the good. In modern times, totally different. You go inside, right? You go inside and you decide who you are. You decide who you really are and what is right and what is wrong for you. Then you come outside and you argue with the culture and you say, you have to honor me because this is who I am. So instead of arguing with yourself to align with what's outside, you argue with the outside to align with what's inside. Radically, radically different, as you see. And lastly, of course, in traditional culture, you don't validate yourself. It might be your parents, it might be your community, it might be your clan, it might be the head of your tribe, it might be your nation, but in traditional identity formation, you don't validate yourself, someone validates you, but in modern identity, you are your own validator. You see that? Philip Reif, a second book, again, hard to read, but extremely important to understanding where we are today. Philip Reif wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And in it, he said that modern identity is not different than traditional identity, it is the reverse. And he says every other culture in the history of the world said the problem is the selfish individual. Every other culture in the history of the world said that what's making the world a mess is the selfish individual who just simply tries to live his or her own life the way that he or she wants. And the only salvation we have, the only way to make things better, is to connect individuals to a sacred order. Now, of course, Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, African tribal religions, they all had very, very different understandings of what that sacred order was. And we're going to get back in the second talk and show that Christianity in many ways is unique. It's not just another traditional identity formation approach. But nevertheless, here's what Christianity is like everything else. As Philip Reese said, every other culture has always said, what's wrong with the world is the selfish individual, and what will fix the world is connecting to a sacred order. We are the first, in the history of the world, the first culture to say, no, what's wrong with the world is people telling me that there's a sacred order out there that I have to live according to. And what will really make the world okay, what will fix the world is if every individual is free to live his or her own life selfishly. And so, in other words, the very thing that ancient cultures thought is wrong, modern culture says this is the fix. And the very thing that ancient cultures say this is the fix, in modern culture, this is what's wrong. In other words, modern culture actually says the thing we need to be redeemed from is the idea that we need to be redeemed. The thing that we need to be saved from is the idea that we need to be saved. I decide what is right or wrong for me. Now, there's many examples of this, and nobody gets this across. This modern approach to identity, I say, is something that every culture imposes on people without telling them what they're doing. And therefore, the only way to really make it more and more visible is to see it. And generally, it doesn't come because you go to some class, and in your 6th year of primary school, some teacher puts a set of bullet points up and says, here's the traditional identity formation. We don't do that anymore. Here's modern identity formation. That's how we're going to do it. Nobody does that. They just do it to you. So, for example, let's just take a look at the media. Let's just take a look at the arts. So, for example, the latest movie, I'm sure I better say this now because I'm sure there'll be a new one soon. The latest J.K. Rowling book movie was Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Is that the name it was over here too? Yeah, I mean, okay. Did anybody see it? It wasn't all that well, I'm not sure it was all that well subscribed, but you know what the main plot of it is? The obscurus. You know what an obscurus is? The obscurus is a kind of giant black cloud amoeba that goes around destroying things, and it happens whenever a witch or wizard repress their magical abilities. So if you're a witch or you're a wizard and they're not letting you be yourself, it actually creates this giant black amoeba cloud that goes around and eats things. You know, important safety tip, right? Don't repress a wizard or witch. But what's the narrative there? The narrative is there's only one heroic narrative left in our culture. And that is not that you sacrifice to save other people. The narrative is that you sacrifice in order to be yourself. So, for example, one of my favorite movies, honestly, is Babe. You know, it's about it's a New Zealand pig that wants to be a sheepdog and wants to win the sheepdog competition. You know that? It's a great movie. Especially the Sansons, the final, the Oregon Symphony, anyway, uses it all the time. I love it. But of course, what's the narrative? What's the narrative? The narrative is even if you're a pig, and if you identify as a sheepdog, then you're a sheepdog. By the way, that's not a new movie. I mean, this is the narrative. Of course, here's the Battle of Malden. It was written, an Anglo-Saxon poem. How old is it? 1,300 years old. And at the very end, when it looks like the Anglo-Saxons are about to die, because I think it's the Danes, are killing them off, and they got a chance. The survivors actually have a chance to hightail it away, but no, they're going to stick with community. And one of the survivors says this. He says, "Here lies my prince, all hewn. I will not away, but I myself beside my Lord, so loved a man, come to lie." Okay, here's my prince, and he's dead, And I could run away, but I would rather die next to my prince, and this is my people, this is who I am. Okay, a more recent poem and song by somebody named Rodgers and Hammerstein. That's an interesting guy. And he says, climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every rainbow till you find your dream. And there, of course, we're talking about Maria, who maybe has good reasons, but the main point of the narrative is I'm going to leave community, leave the convent in order to find myself. By the way, that might have been the right thing for her to do. I'm not trying to say nobody should ever leave a convent. But you see, Martin Luther left a convent. But anyway, and it was good. It was good for us, actually. But you see, the narrative is going to come at you and at you and at you and at you. You don't stay with community. You actually say to community, I've got to be myself. Of course, Elsa. You're just going to start laughing as soon as I say her name, right? It's time to see what I can do, right? No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. What she's doing at that point is to say, I've tried to be a good girl, and I've tried to hold in my gifts, but now even though it's going to actually freeze over my entire country and people are going to die of starvation, I've got to be me. I don't know. If you watch that part of the movie, you're saying, why are we cheering her? She's killing people. But she looks so fabulous, doesn't she? It's amazing. She's walking along and the hair's coming out and oh my gosh, and she's becoming herself. And then of course it destroys the country, and somebody else has to kind of save everybody from her self-expression. And yet there we are singing about it. But the fact of the matter is that's an extremely powerful narrative. It's the reason why it's the heart-stopping key song, and the reason why the song has been taken out of the narrative in a way and used as a theme song, because it is a theme song. I got granddaughters. Yeah, a couple more examples. I got granddaughters. And they love American Girl. Now, thankfully, you don't have it over here. It's basically a doll store and a doll catalog. You buy dolls, and they're really expensive. But in the old days, the way dolls were used, frankly, was in traditional identity formation. And what dolls were used to do was generally to help little girls get used to the idea of caring for children. And that was the purpose of the dolls. It was used, at least, I'm not saying that's good and bad, it's probably a mixture of both, but the fact of the matter is that dolls, every culture is telling you who you are. Every culture is pushing its approach to identity formation on you. And dolls used to be used in the service of the traditional identity formation, but no longer. Here's what the catalog says. There's a million different kinds of dolls now, and here's what they say in the catalog. These dolls will let your daughter know that her individuality is something to celebrate every day. Every little girl has her own story. That's why there's so many different dolls here for them. The stuff that makes you you, this is right out of the catalog, that's set apart from every other girl in the world. Given the chance to express exactly who you are through these dolls, you will share your own inner star. Okay? You might say, boy, that's pretty overt. Well, it is American, but on the other hand, we're polluting the whole world with the modern identity approach. Here's one last thing. I read a pretty fascinating academic book called Identity and Social Change. It's an academic book. It's edited by Joe Davis, if you're really looking for it. But there was one chapter in there on how therapy works, and I thought this was fascinating. This book says that therapy, general therapy, see, what I've shown you right up to now is that virtually all of our media, all of our stories, sitcoms, cinema, everything is pressing not the traditional modern narrative, the traditional identity narrative, which you, by the way, see in something like Lord of the Rings, which is for friendship and loyalty, you sacrifice in order to save others, which has always been the traditional narrative. Now the narrative is you sacrifice to be yourself and to assert yourself and to show people who you are. and that's just coming at you and at you and at you and at you and at you. But the other carrier besides the media is therapy, a lot of therapy. And here's what this one academic says. He says, so much therapy the therapist says to the client, you must not let anyone tell you who you are. You must not be dependent for your worth on anyone else. You must not care what anyone else says. You must choose who you are yourself, and you must validate yourself. Okay, does that sound familiar? Sure it does. And then he adds, the deep irony and even hypocrisy is that the therapist is saying at that moment, the therapist is pushing a very white, Western individualistic view, a highly individualistic view of identity reality on the person, and doing exactly what the therapist is telling the client they must not let anyone else do to them. And at that moment, the therapist is actually being the decisive validator, telling them that what they're doing, their approach is just fine, when he's also saying, or she's also saying to the client, don't let anybody else be your validator. It's just completely disingenuous and hypocritical. And yet, therapy, media, it comes at you all over the place until everybody says, what's water? Meaning, this is the only way to form an identity. And that's the deep background. Now, let me just take a couple more minutes to say why this approach to identity is not working. I'll start my next talk by saying the modern identity is not all horrible. In fact, there's roots of Christianity in it. I'll get to that later, but for now, let me just tell you how horrible it is. Okay? I'll be back to say it's not all horrible, but for right now, I'm in a horrible mood. No, let's just talk about, here's a list of probably 7 ways that it's really unworking. It's not working. Severe problems, 7 severe problems. Number 1, it's incoherent. The modern identity is incoherent. Why? Because it tells you to look into your feelings. Your feelings are the only arbiters of your, you're supposed to look at your feelings. You have no guidance on what is good, what is right, what is wrong. Who are you? Can't talk to anybody else. You have to look into your own heart. But guess what? Your feelings contradict. Your feelings contradict. I like ice cream. I also don't want to be fat. Both of those are strong desires. I'm going to have to choose, you know, well, I'm going to get back to this. Your desires are incoherent. You have a love relationship with this person, and you'd like to maybe marry this person, but if you marry that person, it's going to hurt your job or your career. Both of those are strong desires, and guess what? They actually contradict. You're going to have to make a choice. And you see, then, which is the real you? You know, are you really a career person, or are you and if you try to say, well, what's the deepest desires? Don't be ridiculous. Your desires are always changing. You know, a joke I like to tell, some of you probably heard it because I tell it so often, but you can always look back 10 years ago and you remember what you thought was the most important, and now you think, gosh, boy, I was stupid back then. And then, of course, 10 years from now, you're going to think your current self is stupid, which means you're stupid now. You're stupid right now. And the reason is because your desires are always changing. What kind of identity is based on desires that are somewhat contradictory anyway and are constantly changing? It's just incoherent. You know, Francis Spufford is a British author. In his book, Unapologetic, he's got this great line. He says, eventually, if you get to know yourself, you'll know this. You are a being whose wants make no sense. They don't harmonize. Your desires deep down are discordantly arranged so that you truly want to possess and you truly want not to at the very same time. You are equipped, you realize, much more for farce or even tragedy, much more than you are for happy endings. So, first of all, it's incoherent. Anything that just says, look in yourself and find your strongest desires, and that's who you are, it's crazy. You're going to be somebody else totally next year, and the next year. Besides that, even now, your desires contradict. Number 1, it's incoherent. Number 2, it's fragile. This is what Charles Taylor points out, that the modern self is incredibly fragile. You know why? Because you require that you be the ultimate validator of yourself. Only you get to decide whether you're a good person or not. You don't give that to anybody else. Now, here's what this means. In traditional cultures, and some of you are from traditional cultures, You go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, where basically they're less individualistic cultures, the identity formation is different, and it's largely, traditional identity formation is largely built around pleasing your family and being a good family member. And if your father and your mother in those cultures, who are the ultimate validator, if they look at you and they say, I don't care what anybody else says, you are a good son, you are a good daughter, you're everything I've ever wanted you to be, then who cares what anybody else says about you, right? Because you've given that, here's the danger, of course, when you give any human beings, we'll get back to this, Christians would say, no, don't do this to any human being. But if you give to a human being the right to be your ultimate validator, then they can silence all the critics. But if you yourself, on the inside, you're the validator, you know what that means? And this is where Charles Taylor is great. Charles Taylor says we are irreducibly relational beings. We can't validate ourselves. This is one of the lies. This is one of the absolute illusions of the modern identity. He says he actually has a great, this is the way philosophers talk, but I'll read it. He says, there's no such thing as an identity that comes through inward generation monologically. Identity must be negotiated through dialogue with others. He says, there's no such thing as a monological identity. There's no such thing as you looking inside and saying, I don't care what the whole rest of the world thinks. I think I'm okay. It doesn't work. We desperately need a word from outside. We've got to have somebody from outside telling us that we're okay. We desperately need to. And what Charles Taylor says is because we haven't given that right to anybody, we haven't given it to God or our parents or anybody else, we so desperately need constant affirmation. And this is the reason why, number one, this is all Charles Taylor. Taylor says because we're the ultimate validators and because we're irreducibly relational and we need outside validation, even though we say we don't, we are constantly nervous and fragile. We are suckers for consumerism. We are suckers for advertisers. Kathy and I are staying in a flat at Covent Gardens, and on the weekends, boy, what a place where people are advertising, here's who I am. What a place in Covent Garden. They're just walking around displaying their consumer wares. This is who I am. They're suckers because they desperately need to look incredible. They desperately need to show you because I can buy these products, because I can actually wear these products, and you can't. Look at how great I am and how cool I am. So they are suckers they're very vulnerable to the consumer siren, but also that's the reason why people are melting down now if you even disagree with them. See, because you've got to have constant validation from outside, and because you go out to demand that people agree with you on who you are. If somebody just disagrees, they don't treat it as disagreement. They treat it as an attack. They just fall apart. They fall apart. And that fragility comes because the modern identity is inherently unstable. Yes, there's something smothering about traditional identity. You got to do whatever your parents tell you. And we'll get back to that. But it's not fragile. Not at all. But the modern identity is horribly fragile. So A, it's incoherent. B, it's fragile. C, it's crushing. Alain de Botton, who's an atheist, talks about this in his book Status Envy. But here's the interesting thing. Traditional identity is all about fitting in. You just fit in. Be a good father, be a good mother, be a good son, be a good daughter, okay? Do your role in the society. Traditional identity is all about fitting in, but modern identity is all about standing out. It's about being special. It's about doing great things. It's the reason why, by the way, poor Madonna has to say this. In Vogue magazine, Madonna says, "My drive in life is from the fear of being mediocre. That's always pushing me. I push past one spell of it, and I discover myself as a special human being, but then I feel I'm still mediocre and uninteresting unless I do something else. Because even though I have become somebody, I think, I still have to prove again that I am somebody. My struggle has never ended, and it probably never will." No, it's because it's a crushing identity. So it's crushing. Number 4, it's especially crushing not just to you, but it's a crushing burden for all romantic relationships. Now we're getting a little closer to maybe one of the reasons we're all here. The fact is that in a traditional identity, family was very important. having a spouse and having a family was extraordinarily important. But sex and romance per se was nice and good, a good thing, but not as crucial. Now what's happening is that sex and romance is actually trying to help fragile identities be shored up. A great book on this, a great chapter on this, is Ernest Becker. Nobody has ever heard of him anymore. He's a Jewish, atheist, American author. In 1970, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, Denial of Death. And in it, he's very open about the fact that he's an atheist. But he says, in the past, we got our identity from things like God or nation or going to heaven. But now we have to get our identity and our sense of glory and worth somewhere else. And he calls it, one of the main ways we do it in modern society is through what he calls the romantic solution. Listen to what he says. He says, now we have to get our identity from romance. And this is what he says, quote, the self-glorification we now need to achieve in our innermost being, we look for in our love partner. What is it we want when we elevate the love partner to this position? We want to be rid of our faults. We want to be justified. We want to get rid of our feeling of nothingness. We want to know our existence has not been in vain. We want redemption from our love partner, nothing else. And then he adds, probably with a smile, needless to say, no human being can give you these things. No human being can give these things, but we try. If you go into a romantic, a sexual relationship with modern identities, you will kill each other. Because each person has got to be your glorification. It's where I get my self-worth. Criticism from the other person will devastate you. See? Criticism to the other person is something you probably can't do because you're afraid of getting them angry. It's just dysfunction from the word go. I got to finish here. So number 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5, the modern identity is fragmenting because everybody is making up their own good, their own right and wrong. There's no doubt that our society is fragmenting. Politically, it's fragmenting. We can't get together. There's no one moral order that we all agree on. Charles Taylor at one point says, communities are eroding, families and neighborhoods, even the political polity is eroding. People are less willing to participate, to do their bit. They're less trusting of others and indeed of any institution or authority of any kind. I think I got time just to mention this. There's a book by a woman named Jennifer Senior, maybe pronounced Senior, I'm not sure. It's an American, she's an American author, and she wrote a book on parenting recently, by the way, called All Joy and No Fun. The Paradox of Modern Parenting. But the key to it, it's not a set of how-tos. Here's the key to it. She says, in modern society, every relationship we have now is negotiable, including marriage. That the modern identity says, I don't give myself to anybody. I do not. I stay in relationships as long as it's helping me realize who I am. And the minute it's not working for me, I'm out. She says the only problem with that, there's only one relationship in all of our society left that doesn't fit into the modern identity mold, and that's parenting. Because you can't just say, to your 8-year-old, this relationship's just not working for me. And, you can't say to your 3 children, money's been tight lately, so we're going to have to lay a couple of you off. Which is an American way to say redundancies. But anyway, you can't do that. And she says it's a reason, and she says, basically, she says the modern identity is making it almost impossible to do decent parenting. And then, let's see, 6 and 7, I'll just say these quickly because, 6 I'll say quickly. It's excluding. The way the modern identity is so fragile is bolstered is by feeling superior to other people. Actually, the Pharisee who said, Lord, I thank thee that I am not like this tax collector. That is the essence of a modern identity too. It's also the essence of a traditional identity. Any identity that is achieved through your performance is inherently fragile because you're never sure you've done a good enough job. And so the way you bolster your fearful sense of whether or not I'm good enough is by you look down on people that don't have your identity factor. So if you're proud of being a hardworking person, you're going to have to despise anyone who you think of as lazy. If you're proud of being white, you're going to look down your nose at anybody who's not. And therefore, modern identity is excluding because people are so fragile that anybody who disagrees with them, they have to demonize, and it's one of the ways they feel better. I'm so glad I'm not like those people. The last thing to say, and this is it, is basically it's a sham. The modern identity doesn't work. It's an illusion. It actually can't work at all. And some of you may have heard this illustration. I put it in my preaching book. To prove that modern identity actually doesn't work, I give this illustration. 1,000 years ago, here in London, or Londinium, or whatever it was called then, here you have a pagan Anglo-Saxon walking down the street. He looks into his heart and he sees two feelings. One feeling is he just loves killing people. If they get in his way, he kills them. Okay. The other is he notices same-sex attraction. Now, what's he going to do? Well, he's going to see that aggressive tendency, and in a shame and honor culture, a warrior culture, he's going to say, "That's me. Don't mess with me." But in that culture, he's going to see same-sex attraction. He's going to say, "That's not me. That's not me. That's something. That's a thing, and I got to repress it. It's not me." Today, some young man's walking down the streets of London, and he looks in his heart, and he notices two things. One is that when people get in his way, he lashes out and tries to kill them. And the other is same-sex attraction. Now, what's he going to do? When the aggression, he says, "I need therapy. I need to go get anger management." But the same-sex attraction, he says, "That's me." What's the difference? Is this guy today looking into his heart and figuring out who he is? No. He's looking at all sorts of things in his heart, and there's a grid by which he's saying, "That's not me, that's not me, that's me, that's me." And where'd that grid come from? It came from his culture. He is not looking inside and becoming whoever he decides he wants to be. He is being whatever his culture is telling him he is, just like the Anglo-Saxon. We're no more liberated. The modern identity doesn't work because here's the thing. At least the Anglo-Saxon had a culture that said the way in which you get an identity is you find some good outside and you bring it inside and you align with it. The modern identity says, no, you don't do that. You are true to yourself. But the reality is there's a whole set of what you might call liberal secular values that are being imposed on us, and you're being basically told you have to align with those. And so you're really not finding yourself. The modern identity is to a great degree a sham. Kierkegaard, when he spoke about the problem of modern identity, I think this is from Sickness Unto Death, he finished like this. He says, "In fact, what is called the secular mentality consists simply of such those who, so to speak, mortgage themselves to the world. They use their talents to amass wealth, carry on enterprises, they try to make a name for themselves, but they themselves have not become. Spiritually speaking, they have no self with which they could venture everything, however self-seeking they are otherwise."